This is a response for RPGaDay 2017 from the Casting Shadows blog.
Today's video is in response to question 12 of RPGaDay for 2017. The question asks us about inspiring interior illustrations in RPG books. And of course, the question will use the word most, the most inspiring. I thought about this for a while, and I figured, being a big Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars guy, liking Shadowrun as much as I do, and blah blah blah, that'd be pretty easy to pull out a book and find some pretty awe-inspiring art, or just plain inspiring art. And then I started thinking about the third edition of Warhammer and how impressive those books are, and then it hit me. I was going in completely the wrong direction, and there had been an illustration fighting to get out of the fires of my mind for quite a while. What I was remembering was an old piece of Jeff D. art in an old Dungeons & Dragons first edition module called The Secrets of the Slaver's Stockade. That's A2. When you open that, this was the first module. I'm pretty sure it was the first module that I bought. It wasn't the first one I'd seen, had my hands on, but it was the first one that was mine, And I read that 1,000 times. I only had to play it once. But I read it, and I reread it, and I reread it, and I reread it. And you have to imagine, this is just a small booklet, this module, designed for tournament play. It's very punchy. Not a lot of story in there, just challenge after challenge after challenge. But I was learning so much as a new Game Master and Dungeons & Dragons player, relatively new, just from reading it. Things that I hadn't considered doing, or things that I did in different ways. And a big part of the inspiration from this module for me was the art. And there's almost no art in this whole thing. Not including the maps, which are, a different kind of art. And when you open it up, there is this half-page picture of this fighter. It's a guy wearing a horned helmet. He has his fists out, and he's clearly enraged and caught in the throes of emotion. And he's holding what seems to be molten something. Right? His fists are blazing, but the standout feature that you get right away is the fact that in his helmet, it's a full visor with no eye slits. You know immediately that this character is blind, and you have one of these questioning moments. A blind fighter? Well, this character's name was Icar, or I've met people who called him Icar, but I always called him Icar. Maybe Icar is a better word for such a violent encounter, but that image of him standing there like that got me thinking in a lot of different ways. My games were slightly tactical, I think, by the time I got to read that module. But conscious decisions to put in planned and character-specific tactics were something I think that was still pretty random, because I can remember breaking out that module and reading over the character of Icar again and again, and figuring out what would be an interesting way to have low-level opposition be interesting. Now, in that module, he's not particularly low-level, but that was my interest at the time, is I didn't want to keep ramping up the ability of the opposition. I wanted to figure out ways to use the opposition better. I wanted to do more with less, and I guess that's stuck with me all down through the years. I still do that. But the inspiration for being able to put, let's say, a skin over top of the opposition, it hadn't reached a level where I would consider putting in a character who was blind, per se, and could be assumed to rely on their other senses. And there's nothing about his stat block that says anything about being able to operate while blind. He just can. which is a great part about early Dungeons and Dragons that it's fun to rediscover in the other games that I play now. The go for it attitude, the modify what's there, and make that character or that scene element or that situation interesting, as long as it's not messing with people. It doesn't harm anybody that this character is blind. It's just an interesting detail. It's no different than fighting a regular fighter. But I would go back to this picture again and again. I would go back to the stat block, and I'd go back to the encounter section where you meet this character over and over and over again, and just read it. I read it until I could no longer see the words anymore, and there's nothing really left in that module for me but the small pieces of art. So that piece by D, really hit me, it walloped me, and this is one I always remember when people talk about interior art. This is one of the first things that comes to my mind. So that module, though, has more art in it than just this very big and in-your-face picture of an NPC. There's this very small picture which occurs later in the Stronghold description, or the Stockade description, and it's your viewpoint is that you're at the top of the stairs looking down, and in the background of the image you can see the adventuring group, and there's very little detail about them, which I also liked, but what strikes me about this picture is that the staircase doesn't look that deep. It's like a small staircase, something that you might find in the front of your house, just a regular staircase. It's bringing them down a little bit lower onto a lower floor space. But the walls soar up to the ceiling. This is a sense of scale in this very, very tiny picture, which, really is impressive how it manages to communicate the depth of this room. It's a very narrow passage, it seems like they're going into, but the walls just go up and up and up forever. And this is something which I was reading in Moorcock, and I was reading in Tolkien, but I was not transmitting in my descriptions, and I wasn't really aware of it. And then looking at this picture, I wanted people to be imagining rooms like that picture. And I began to, again, consciously try to evoke that sense. I think I was leaving things out of description. I was imagining things, and I was talking about the raw details of the room, like how far they could see in the light, and how wide the door was, how difficult it was to pass through with the gear that they were carrying, but not the sense of where the ceiling is, if you know what I mean, or the sense of scale as you first enter into a larger chamber or a larger cavern or whatnot. I was giving lots of description to small, cramped rooms because that was tactically important, and I was not allowing myself to share in the joy and wonder of experiencing a larger room or coming across a vista. That picture in A2 was so inspiring to me, it changed how I described rooms, or how I tried to describe rooms. The last picture, also in A2, that I want to talk about, was not a picture I particularly liked. Like, it wasn't like, oh, cool kind of picture. It was a picture that had really interesting details in it. And it's in the section where you come across a character named Marquesa, and this is a particularly nasty encounter, and it involves goblin bodyguards. And so the illustration is of this elven female character, fighter, obviously, standing in the background, directing the goblins to the attack. And looking at that, I recognized that while my game worlds were not devoid of female presences, they were pretty much devoid of major NPCs being female. None of us were playing females. We weren't at that point playing with any girls, so it was really, really top heavy with guys. And that picture made me think, well, why am I not using women as some of the major antagonists or the powers behind the throne, the powers on the throne, the people that we're meeting in taverns that have problems, and all the cliche, what would get incorporated into Mr. Johnson in Shadowrun, the people giving quests or having problems or doing the hiring and whatnot. Why are these all men? And so from that point on, they stopped being all men just by the virtue of this one picture. I suppose the other influence that picture had on me is that I didn't like goblins, halflings, or any of the tiny waves of creatures. And around this time is also when I just stopped using them. And I wouldn't really come back to them until I started getting into pulp gaming as an adult living here in Korea and recognizing that mook rules were okay, that they were a part of simulating genre, and I could get around having wave after wave of them and having them not be statistically the same as a typical character. But to stick to the topic of inspirational art, I find it really interesting to me that even though I'm surrounded by some of these lavishly illustrated, full color, glossy page games, that the only real answer that I can give that feels true, as an inspirational art that had an effect, is to go back to A2, this first module that I owned, and all the wonders that it gave me as I read it and reread it and reread it and reread it in hopes to one day be able to run it. And then after I ran it, rereading it again in hopes to do that again. But here endeth the response for question 12. Tomorrow, question 13 is kind of related. It's asking us to describe an experience we had while role-playing, which changed how we played.
To find more responses, search for the hashtag RPGaDay or visit RPGaDay.com.